We saw a clearing where the trees leaned inward, as if listening. At first it looked like a natural opening, just a break in the density of the old forest. But the longer we stood at the edge of it, the more wrong it felt. The trees did not grow away from the space like they should have. They bent toward it, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough that every trunk angled inward, every branch curving slightly toward the middle, like a ring of bodies huddled close around a quiet conversation. The forest around us was ancient, one of those places where the trees had grown undisturbed for centuries. Their bark was blackened and deeply furrowed, moss clinging to them in long strips that looked like hanging fabric. The ground was thick with needles and old rot, soft enough that our boots sank without sound. Yet when we reached the clearing's edge, the forest fell silent in a way I had never heard before. Not quiet, silent. No insects, no wind through needles. Even the creak of branches overhead seemed to pause, as though the air itself were holding its breath. Mark stepped forward first. "Look at the trunks," he murmured. I had already noticed. Each tree leaned toward the center of the clearing by the same slight degree, like compass needles pointing inward. Even the smaller saplings bent subtly in that direction. "What causes that?" he asked. No one answered. Clara crouched near the edge, brushing her fingers across the soil. No animal tracks. The ground inside the clearing was strangely bare. No shrubs, no fallen branches, only a wide circle of dark earth and pale grass that looked flattened, as if something heavy had once rested there. Or many things. The trees ringed the space in a perfect boundary. Listening, I stepped forward. The temperature dropped immediately. A cold pocket of air settled around my legs, damp and still. The smell changed too, less like pine and soil, more like stone after rain. Behind me, someone whispered, "Do you hear that?" We all stood still. At first I thought it was wind returning, but it wasn't moving through the branches. It was moving through the clearing. A faint, low murmur that rose and fell in uneven waves, like voices heard through walls. "Echo," Mark said quickly. But there had been no sound to echo. I turned slowly in place. The leaning trees seemed closer now, their branches tangled overhead, dimming the light even though the sky above the clearing was open. For a moment, I had the strange impression that the trunks had shifted. Just slightly. Clara straightened suddenly. Did anyone else feel that? What? The ground. I waited. A moment later it happened again. Not an earthquake. Not even a tremor. Just a slow, subtle tightening beneath the soil, as if something deep underground had taken a quiet breath. The murmur returned. This time the sound moved around us. Not through the air. Through the trees. Branches creaked softly. Not from wind, but from motion. I watched a heavy limb above the clearing dip lower, bending with a slow patience that made my stomach tighten. Mark noticed it too. "Okay," he said. That's not normal." The limb stopped once it had angled further toward the center. Toward us. We were standing exactly where the clearing center seemed to be. Clara backed up a step, and the murmur grew louder. Still didn't sound like language, but there was rhythm to it. A pulse. A rising and falling pattern that reminded me of distant chanting carried through stone halls. I glanced toward the treeline. Something moved. Not a figure. Just the suggestion of something darker sliding between the trunks. Too tall. Too narrow. A shadow stretching upward along bark before vanishing again. "Did you see?" "Yes," Clara said immediately. Another shadow appeared. Then another. They were not separate shapes. They moved like reflections sliding across water, impossible to focus on directly, but unmistakably there. Watching. The forest had resumed its sounds now, but they were wrong. The creaking branches repeated themselves in strange loops, like echoes arriving before their cause. Our footsteps seemed to linger a moment too long in the air after we shifted our weight. Mark turned slowly. "We should go." No one argued, but when we stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the ground shifted again. This time I felt it clearly. Roots. Moving. Not violently, just a slow curling beneath the soil like muscles tightening. Clara stumbled as the earth beneath her boot lifted slightly. A thin root surfaced, pale and slick with dirt, sliding across the ground like a searching finger. The trees creaked again. When I looked up, they were leaning further inward. Not much, but enough to notice. Branches lowered. The clearing darkened, and the murmur resolved into something more deliberate. Not voices, breathing. Hundreds of slow, patient breaths moving through the trunks around us. Mark whispered, "It's reacting." The moment he said it, a sharp crack echoed behind us. One of the outer trees had shifted. Not fallen. Moved. Its trunk angled slightly further into the circle, roots grinding quietly beneath the soil. The clearing tightened. The ring of trees closing like the slow contraction of a fist. "Run," Clara said. But none of us did. Because the shadows had gathered along the treeline now. Tall, wavering silhouettes that leaned the same way the trees did, tilting toward the clearing center. Toward us. The breathing deepened. Cold air pooled around our ankles, then our knees. The ground pulsed again. And suddenly I understood the shape of the space. The leaning trunks. The bare soil. The shadows watching from the perimeter. This wasn't a clearing. It was a place that had been used. Many times. The trees weren't leaning by accident. They were forming something. A circle. A listening circle. Where the forest gathered around what stood in the middle. Where it waited. The murmuring breath rose to a low hum that vibrated through the ground. Mark took another step back. Immediately a branch above him shifted downward, blocking the path behind us. Not falling. Placed. The shadows in the treeline leaned closer, stretching taller, like figures standing on invisible legs. Watching the center. Watching us. Or maybe just one of us. Clara's voice came out thin. "Why here?" No one answered. But the forest did. A deep groan rolled through the trees as their roots tightened beneath the earth. The trunks bent further inward. And the murmur gathered into a single long exhale that drifted through the clearing like a word almost remembered. Waiting. That was the feeling that filled the space. Not hunger. Not anger. Expectation. Because the clearing wasn't reacting to strangers wandering through. It was responding to something it had been waiting for. For a long time, the shadows pressed closer against the ring of trees now, tall and indistinct, their shapes flickering between trunks like reflections trying to take form. And slowly, so slowly I almost missed it, the trees leaned one final inch inward. Not toward all of us. Toward Mark. He froze. The ground beneath his feet shifted, roots tightening in a loose spiral around his boots. The breathing deepened again. And for the first time, the murmuring resolved into something unmistakably human. Not words. Names. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Whispered through bark and branches, rising softly from the soil. Every name the forest had ever been given. Every name of those who had stood in that circle before. And beneath those fading echoes, something older stirred beneath the clearing. Something that had learned, over centuries, that people would always come walking through the woods eventually. The leaning trees were not listening for secrets. They were listening for footsteps, waiting for someone to stand in the center again, waiting for the forest to choose who would stay. Something brushed past us, leaving frost on our clothes. At first I thought it was just a cold pocket of air sliding through the trees. Forests sometimes do that, release sudden drafts from shaded ravines or hollows where sunlight never reaches. But cold air doesn't leave patterns. When I looked down, the sleeve of my jacket was dusted with thin white crystals. Frost spread across the fabric in delicate branching lines, sharp as etched glass. We had been hiking for hours, pushing deeper into the old-growth forest than the trail map suggested was possible. The trees were enormous. Centuries old at least, their trunks twisted and layered with moss that hung like damp cloth. The deeper we walked, the colder the air became. Not gradually, in steps. Each mile felt like crossing an invisible threshold where the temperature dropped another degree. "Did you feel that?" Aaron asked. His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet around us. No insects buzzed. No birds called overhead. Even the usual creak of branches seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened. Clara wiped her sleeve. Frost clung stubbornly to the wool. "That's not normal," she murmured. Our breath fogged in front of us now, thin white plumes drifting upward into the motionless canopy. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The forest floor was blanketed with old needles and pale stones, but here and there frost had begun to appear, thin veins of white stretching across roots and fallen bark. Aaron exhaled slowly. "Maybe there's ice underground or something. But ice doesn't move." And the frost on my sleeve was moving. At first it looked like ordinary crystal growth, tiny branching filaments spreading outward in slow motion. But the lines were too deliberate, too symmetrical. They curved and intersected like careful handwriting. "Don't wipe it off," Clara said suddenly. I froze. She stepped closer, squinting at the frost forming across my arm. "It's forming shapes." The crystals had reached my wrist now. The lines were no longer random. They were arranging themselves into small repeating symbols. Sharp angles, narrow loops, tiny intersecting marks that looked almost like runes scratched into glass. Aaron leaned closer. "Is that a language?" I shook my arm reflexively. The frost cracked apart and fell in brittle flakes onto the ground. The moment it did, the temperature dropped again. Not just colder, sharper. The kind of cold that crawls through fabric and settles directly into bone. We all noticed it at once. Clara's breath came out in thicker clouds now. Aaron rubbed his hands together. "Okay, that's weird." A faint creaking sound drifted through the forest. Not wind. The trees were moving. Slowly. The trunks weren't swaying, but their branches shifted against one another with soft scraping noises like old wood flexing under pressure. We stood perfectly still. The sound came again. A long, patient creak. Then silence. Something moved behind us. Not a shape. Just a disturbance in the cold air, like the space itself had been displaced for a moment. The temperature plunged instantly. And again, something brushed past us, leaving frost on our clothes. This time we all felt it. A narrow rush of cold, so intense it burned across my cheek like dry ice. Aaron flinched. When he looked down, the front of his jacket was covered in frost. Not scattered, focused. The crystals gathered across the center of his chest, spreading outward in branching patterns. "Don't move," Clara whispered. The frost began to grow. Slowly, carefully. The symbols returned, sharp, intersecting lines forming deliberate shapes across the dark fabric. Aaron's breathing quickened. "Why me?" The question fogged in the air. The frost continued writing. Behind us, the trees creaked again. This time, the sound rippled outward through the forest like a distant signal being passed from trunk to trunk. A whisper followed. Not words exactly, just soft breath-like sounds threading through the branches overhead. I turned slowly. Shadows had begun shifting between the trees, not moving in any clear direction, just leaning, tilting slightly toward us, toward Aaron. The frost reached his collar. "Guys," he said quietly, "I think it's spelling something." Clara crouched, studying the pattern. Her face drained of color. "It's not spelling," she said. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the symbols. "They're repeating." The frost lines continued to spread outward from the center of his chest, forming the same three shapes again and again, like a seal or a brand. Aaron tried brushing it away. The frost vanished instantly, for half a second. Then it returned. Not slowly this time. It surged across his coat in a sudden bloom of white, thicker than before, the symbols cutting deeper into the frost as though etched by invisible fingers. Aaron gasped. The cold around us intensified sharply. My eyelashes began to freeze together when I blinked. The whispers in the forest grew louder, and something moved between the trees. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its shape barely visible against the dim trunks. Where it passed, frost spread across bark and stone. Not drifting, crawling. The forest responded immediately. Branches bent slightly toward the path it took. The air tightened. The frost on Aaron's chest brightened in pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. The cymbals pulsed once. Then again, like a heartbeat. "Run," Aaron said hoarsely. But Clara shook her head slowly. "Don't." "Why?" Her voice trembled. "Because it already chose." The figure between the trees stopped. Not facing us. Facing Aaron. The frost reacted instantly. The symbols extended outward across his shoulders and arms, thin crystalline lines spreading like veins of ice. Aaron's breath came out in ragged bursts. "I can't feel my hands." The whispers sharpened. This time they almost sounded like words. Fragments of voices carried through cold air. Names. Old ones. Hundreds layered over each other. And suddenly I understood something terrible. The frost wasn't freezing him. It was remembering him. Or something like him. The symbols weren't writing a message. They were recording one. Each branching line identical to marks carved into old stones we had passed earlier along the trail, weathered circles etched with the same repeating pattern. Clara whispered the realization aloud. "It's a marker." Aaron stared at her. "For what?" The cold figure stepped closer through the trees. Where it moved, the forest froze in perfect silence. The frost on Aaron's chest spread one final inch. The symbol completed itself. And in that moment the whispers stopped. The cold retreated slightly. The frost hardened into a thin white scar across the fabric of his coat. Perfectly still. Finished. Aaron looked down at it, confused. "That's it." Clara didn't answer right away. She was staring at the trees. At the old stones half buried beneath frost along the forest floor. Every one of them marked with the same symbol now glowing faintly on Aaron's chest. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. "It's not a warning." The cold figure between the trees dissolved into drifting frost. The forest slowly released a breath. But the symbol remained. Pale flame etched into ice. Clara looked at Aaron with quiet horror. It's how the forest remembers who belongs to it. And far deeper in the woods, beyond the reach of the trail, the temperature dropped again, waiting for the moment the frost would need to find him once more.